It is the Green Edition on Newsgang. It is a single topic night, the Africa Climate Voice. The final word, blending Kaikai's kicker and my take, celebrates Kenya's proud 3 days at the KICC, but yearns for more. The guest gangster list is green in color. Dr. Mohamed Ado, who is the director for PowerShift Africa, Philip Osano, who's the Center Director for the Stockholm Environment Institute, and our very own Pamela Asigi, who's an environmental journalist and Citizen TV's managing editor, completes the Climate Gangland night here on Newsgang. We are green. The Newsgang is here.
Let the declaration of our commitment to act in unison and deliver our aspirations go forth in the firm, clear voice of a united Africa from Nairobi today, and tell the world about Africa's youth potential, opportunity, and its capacity to actualize a world of possibility.
All right, we look forward to your feedback as well. The hashtag is Newsgang at Citizen TV Kenya. Please do share your thoughts with us on the outcome of the summit. Did it meet your expectations? Are we good to go now that we've got an Africa Climate Voice? Ladies, gentlemen, it's good to host you all here with me. Let me begin, of course, with the guests in the room. Mohamed, I'd like to begin with you. Just your reflections on the summit, the outcome, the organization, and of course, the Nairobi Declaration. What are your thoughts around that?
Thank you so much. I think the first thing for me to say, it's great for the continent of Africa to come together for the first time in an African Climate Summit. In the 33 years of international climate negotiations, Africans have been guests in international summits. Never have we had the summit that we've had in Nairobi. But when you look at the summit outcomes, I must say the summit declaration is weak and inadequate. We're in a world where the climate is changing, and the continent of Africa, which is home to 17% of the global population, who have emitted the least. Between our 17% of the global population, we're only responsible for less than 4% of the emissions. But when you look at it from an historic perspective, from when we started emitting carbon dioxide, the total emissions of Africa is just 0.5% of the total global emissions. What we wanted out of Nairobi is for Africa to chart the right path between the two wrong paths. On one hand, you have Africa's polluters who wants to follow in the footsteps of the historic polluters who've caused climate change in the first place. These folks want to follow in their footsteps and be able to dig more fossil fuels. On the other hand, you have the historic polluters, the Western countries, countries that are home to about 20% of the global population, but account for nearly 3/4 of the historic emissions. Rather than cutting emissions at the source, these countries want to actually have Africa cut their emissions as they continue to pollute in the name of buying what I will call pollution permits, but has been sold to the continent of Africa in this summit as carbon credits. So this was an opportunity for us to chart a just transition for Africa. Renew Africa's strategic vision so that we can be able to tackle the intersecting crises of climate, energy crisis, the development crisis, the debt crisis, the hunger that continues to stalk the continent of Africa. If you ask me, this continent faces 3 strategic deficiencies. The first one is we have food deficit. We don't have food sovereignty. 85% of the food we eat in this continent is imported. We also have an energy deficit. 600 million Africans do not have access to electricity. 970 million Africans still don't have clean cooking. So there was an opportunity for us to actually prioritize how we deliver sustainable energy access for this continent, but do it in a way that is climate compatible. The third thing is the low value-added content of our export relative to our imports. We don't have a pan-African green industrialization. And if you look at our world with the change in geopolitics, there is a contestation between the big global powers. And they see our continent as a source of cheap raw materials and as a market for their finished products. And they want to effectively control how Africa makes its climate and energy policy. And so the opportunity this continent had in Nairobi was for us to actually set a strategic vision where we take control of our own destiny, where Africans chart for the first time a climate vision that is also going to help us be able to develop in a clean way.
Okay.
And I must say, we fell short.
If I heard you right, Dr. Addow, it seems to me that you think the continent should have looked more inward than outward in this summit, because we've had very strong voices coming out of the KICC, especially directed at the big polluters, and that is the Western nations. Maybe even as you respond to that, would you like to elaborate a bit more on what you mean by new polluters, especially on the African continent? Because what we saw at KICC also is the continent saying we are the least polluters. The big polluters are out there, not here. And
that's true. If you look at the case of the example of Kenya, 92% of our generated electricity is renewable. And this country has committed to 100% renewables by 2030. And that's a very ambitious commitment that Kenya has made. What Kenya failed, and I must say this as a Kenyan and as an African, was for Kenya to actually work out the kind of international cooperation it will need to put together with other African countries to be able to attract the financing that will allow Kenya to be able to leapfrog that energy. The conversation was narrowly framed around how Africa will actually contribute to the global mitigation objective. Between me and you, we have no emissions to cut. We have emissions to avoid. It's more about how we can develop in a climate-compatible way, leapfrog that energy and become a green leader. When you look at this summit declaration, and I will invite you to look at the draft that was shared with us and look specifically at paragraph 17, it calls this continent to accelerate efforts to reduce emissions. Well, this continent requires efforts that will help it develop in a climate-compatible way by avoiding emissions. If you look at the way the International Climate Dialogue is set up, you will only attract mitigation finance if you're dirty. Okay? What we needed is to go with a new playbook that allows us to be able to present a case that will help this continent attract the investment that will make it develop in a climate-compatible way. And then the next big thing that is missing in this document, if we're the most affected continent and we didn't cause climate change, where is adaptation? Where is resilience in this document? I come from Garissa, a part of this country that has been ravaged by droughts. If you look at the incidence and severity of droughts in northern Kenya, they've been increasing. And that's true for the Wall of Horn of Africa. If you look at other parts of the continent, Southern Africa floods, cyclones, what we needed is for us to actually elevate adaptation. You have a document that privileges mitigation over adaptation. And in the past, you've had African leaders say, our #1 priority is to adapt. Where is adaptation in this document? Why have we accepted this narrative that has been pushed on the developing world to basically cut emissions, rather than prioritize how we will actually save our lives and livelihoods, how we will secure our well-being in the face of climate change? The world has only warmed at 1.1 degree above pre-industrial level. Yeah. The global goal that we're working towards is 1.5, but we're on a pathway to 2.4 degrees. Okay? What we expected is for Africa to raise the alarm bells and say, given the predictions from science, we will integrate climate risk and uncertainties and help this continent develop in a climate-compatible way and demand from the historic polluters climate reparation, climate debt. It's not charity. You've heard about the 23 million being...
Yes, I was just about to ask about that. Yeah, the $23 billion to fund climate-focused development initiatives. Philip, let me bring you in here. Is this addressing the real issues that Mohamed Ado is, talking about in terms of, where we are with the climate, the efforts that are being made, adaptation versus mitigation, and all of these things. What's your standpoint as to what we're able to achieve, if anything, with this climate summit?
Thank you, Yvonne. And I think it's very interesting listening to Mohamed. Maybe I can just put this into context.
Okay.
Right from the beginning of global environmental diplomacy, which is 1972, Kenya has been a top player. That's the reason we host in Nairobi the United Nations Environment Program, because when there was the meeting in Stockholm in 1972, Kenya stepped up. At that time, a very young country, just 4 years from independence, and they took the initiative to lead the rest of the developing countries. And I think that has been sustained over the periods of the leadership that we've had. So I think for me, the first, as somebody who studies environmental diplomacy, I think the first scorecard is that, the fact that this current government has maintained that consistency of showing that Kenya can provide leadership in environment is a big score. That we shouldn't ignore. And I think it's also to put in the context that it is not just climate change. Climate change is just one of the multiple environmental problems and challenges that the world is facing. In fact, I think now we make them, to make them simpler to the ordinary person, we talk about the triple planetary crisis. So we talk about climate change, we talk about biodiversity loss, and we talk about pollution and waste management. This past week, I think every other day I look at the newspapers, I look at the television. That's been the topic. So I think just in terms of the level of raising awareness, I don't think we've had any time in the last few years where we've just had consistently about 2 weeks of just having climate change dominating the headlines. And I think it dominated the headlines for very good reason, because whereas there would be people that got frustrated by not seeing what they wanted to come out of the Nairobi Declaration and the process. There are also quite a lot of people that came out with exhibitions, for example, of innovations that are providing solutions. I think we saw one promising area is electric vehicles. You saw the president driving his electric car when he was going to the youth conference. So for me, that's been something that I think it's been very good to to consider. I think when it comes to the discussions, again, even in Africa, you have more than 50 countries. They're all different culturally. They're different at different economic stages of development. They're different, have different levels of emissions. Even if on average, you think that the continent itself emits about 4.8% percent of the total global share. So it's also quite an effort to try to get them all to come together. But I wanted to point out that in terms of the content, I think for me, the main achievement is, again, to place the fact that climate and development are not separate things. It's been a struggle in the global discourse for people to separate climate and development. And of course, clearly, with the Nairobi Declaration, it points to the fact that climate and development are one and the same thing. And you can't talk about doing development at this stage of where we are and not do climate or do the one and the other.
I just want to ask, a follow-up on that in terms of the Africa Climate Summit, a Nairobi Declaration. To what extent was this representative of the African voice? So we've got 55 countries on the continent, 12 heads of state only. There were some, perhaps, significant absences from some of the big economic powerhouses of the region. Did we have Nigeria, for instance, South Africa, which are, some of those big players? I mean, even our neighbor, Uganda, which is probably Kenya's biggest trading partner, was missing from it. So to what extent was this the African position? And also, is it possible for us to have an African position? One of the biggest arguments about climate change and having governments around the world commit to anything is that countries have different priorities. Countries have different, stages and domestic policies that they have to deal with. So to what extent is it possible for us to say, one, the Nairobi Declaration spoke for all of Africa, and two, whether speaking as one, as a region or a continent, is even possible or wise?
you know, the fact that some presidents were not there does not mean the countries were not represented. I think we should make that clear. Okay. Number two, the way the African Union works, and this was an African Union conference, is that they create subcommittees. And so Kenya hosted this conference as the chair of the subcommittee that looks at climate change. It's called the Committee of African Heads of States on Climate Change, CAHOSC. So at least you have to check and see if some countries were not represented, but the fact that the head of state was not there does not mean the country is not represented. And two, I guess also we need to make sure that we understand that, you know, when you have a summit like this, it is not that people come and sit down there and talk and then sign a document. It is actually a process that goes on for a long period of time. As a matter of fact, for the African Climate Summit, the decision was made at the 36th African Union Assembly in February. So it's not long ago. Yeah. And for that decision to have been made at that point, from that point on, there have been conversations in different spaces, among governments, among different groups and so on, that have informed the final outcome from the Nairobi Declaration. Okay.
Pamela, you've you've attended several such summits. In fact, you're a delegate at this one. Sometimes for many people who are watching at home, and we had extensive coverage, we were live, we jumped from one session to another during the day, I mean, like throughout the day. Is the climate supposed to speak to the people? Is it another talk shop? What are these conversations we're having about greenwashing, carbon credit trading, and that market? Like, is there a sense in which this was not meant for the people, or did it actually do that? I mean, I know, Philip says, yes, it's raised awareness, and for this entire week, there's nothing the country has been talking about. But is there a sense sometimes in which it's talking shop and doesn't perhaps carry all of us along?
I got a sense that the first day was, and even the second day, was more or less a talk shop. And I'm not saying this in bad jest, but I'm just looking back at the journey and from Copenhagen. I think we were there with Ado, and there were very many big promises at the time. And maybe the only positive thing for the first time is that we felt there was a united African voice. I don't know what that means in retrospect, because as you said, 15 countries out of 54, that's a very small number. But I think the kind of targets set, I think some of them very ambitious, but even the text itself almost reminds me of the text I saw in Copenhagen. Cut emissions, do this and that.
$100 billion.
So $100 billion has been there
about for how long?
From Copenhagen. Yeah. $100 billion. And I don't know where this money was going to come from. Then another thing that I also think maybe quite ambitious is the call for reforms for financial infrastructure. Remember, the people who are giving out money are the Westerners, or the North, as we call them. I just don't know how, and maybe I do, and we'll explain. But I don't know how that. I actually doubt that that is likely to come out. I felt that in terms of momentum in terms of coverage, this was perhaps one of the best in Africa. I covered Durban. Yes, there were so many international media. But for the East African region, I think this was, it's come at a time when it's just about a few months to COP28 in Dubai. And then remember, there's also a meeting, I think, in India this weekend, if I'm not wrong. So I guess it's building the momentum. Yeah. But I think what has been lacking also is that we have this beautiful document, then what? We take it to the table in COP, and then what?
Maybe, Pam, maybe you can also just comment on the structure of this conference and this particular climate summit, where we had a number of plenaries going on, and some were actually so critical Is the structure helpful in terms of taking forward the conversation, or does it give prominence to some areas than others? Because what comes out of this conference is the financing architecture. It comes out as almost the main thing. Yet, in there was also food security conversations. There was also blue economy conversations. And
women.
Adaptation, scaling up adaptation, which is what Mohammed was talking about. But these were subjected to parallel processes. And therefore, did that structure probably even affect the prominence of some of those issues?
Not necessarily. I think more often than not, because I see when we covered Copenhagen, we covered very little of the plenary. But then you find that I think then, unless you understand the context of the summit, there are so many breakaway sessions, but also depends on what is it that you want from these breakaway sessions. We had sessions on renewable energy, which were very extremely good. There were sessions on, as you said, food security, women and climate change, even health. It's just that I think, I don't know. I don't know if they really built a lot of momentum in terms of communicating to the media itself. I felt, and this I'm talking as a Kenyan journalist, I felt there was just talk, we are going to have this big conference, and it was almost like a tree planting session. Yeah, so I think if the government ever wants anything that is related to climate change and you want to talk all these issues, it has to go beyond our ambition of planting 15 billion trees, which is another thing we also have to look at. Are we able as a country to plant 15 billion trees? This is what you call in the amended, and remember on Friday last week, we hurriedly passed the amended Climate Change Act.
Yes.
And when you look at the act critically, it only talks about, there are critical issues there. Obviously, one of them is trying to make sure that the communities understand even the carbon markets. But also, there is where Kenya says there's the nationally determined contribution, where Kenya obviously set itself to make sure that they cut emissions 32% by 2030. We are how many years to? 7 years. I don't know if we can plan those 15 billion. And then who also told us that, because we are talking about greenhouse gas emissions, planting trees will not stop methane. We only need to know how do we, when we dump our food from the houses that we dump in Dandora, Dandora emits more methane than any other place. Have we ever thought about that? So when you say about 15 billion trees that are going to make sure that we lower greenhouse gases, that to me is, I don't know, it's a different conversation, but we must remember what are these locally or inward-looking solutions we have to find as Kenya before we go out there to beg. When you beg, the begging basket, you start from home. Thank you.
Can I just say, if you put aside the green rhetoric and you look at the history of Africa's engagement in the international climate process and the structures that the continent has developed, such as the Africa Group of Negotiators, the African Ministerial Conference on Environment that happened last month, this document doesn't respect those positions.
In what way?
So the continent of Africa has stood in solidarity with the developing countries to defend what is called the equity principles, demanding the polluter pays. So what they've done now is negated the differentiation between developed and developing countries and lumped them together and calls international community. So new language is getting introduced into the climate discourse that does not take into account the difference in historic contributions and difference in capability.
And just so that our viewers can follow, because it's a technical subject. So the introduction of this new language would affect us how, or the war on climate change?
So in 1992, the world agreed the UN Convention on Climate Change. Article 4 of the UN Convention is what has, the equity principles, that we will take action to combat climate change in accordance with equity and our common but differentiated responsibility and our respective capability. Now, what this does now is they've put all the countries in the same box.
Basket, yeah.
Like you effectively, whether you're Chad or the US, that is home to 5% of the global population, but accounts for 1/3 of the historic emissions, there's no difference between them. And then when it comes to the global south, there are instances where it says global south and global north, and demands of the global south exactly what it demands of the global north. So that's one thing. And then when it comes to impacts, how we deal with the inevitable impact of climate change, they've now again lumped adaptation and loss and damage together. And so that you understand, adaptation is what you can adapt to. The impact of climate change, that if you invested in resilience, you can be able to withstand. Loss and damage deals with adverse impact that exceeds human adaptive capacity. Now, one of the highlights of COP27 was an agreement to create a loss and damage fund. This document doesn't have anything calling for the historic polluter to even honor their commitments to double adaptation finance. So it repeats what was agreed 14 years ago in Copenhagen for the rich world to provide developing countries, North Africa, 100 billion. And that is pittance when you compare it against the actual needs of Africa and the rest of the global south to be able to actually contribute to tackle a problem that we did not create. And so the third thing that I also want to say is when it comes to the reforms of the international financial institutions, it only marked out the MDBs, World Bank, not the IFIs. So if you look at the document...
And the IFIs are just for all...
So the IMF.
Yes.
The IMF.
Yes.
Now, we weren't there when these institutions were created.
Yes.
We want them to be reformed. And the language of that section is quite strong and quite helpful. But it doesn't actually address the IMF. And then there's introduction of global taxes.
Oh, yeah. And we'll come back and talk about that as well. Yeah, I just want to put a pause there because, there's taxes and there's a carbon tax. And Kenyans, like we said, when you look at local priorities, Kenyans are now panicking, yet another tax. We'll come back and talk about that. So I'm sorry to interject for a moment. I want to take a break, but not before we hear from you, Philip, on so everything that has been said so far. What happens when we go forward, when we go to COP28? So we take this declaration, and then what happens? What do we do with it as Africa?
So to my understanding, this declaration does not negate any other declaration that has been made, including, of course, decisions that have been taken, for example, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So what happens as we go forward? I think every country, first I need to make it clear also that when countries develop what they're calling their nationally determined contribution, which Pamela talked about, it's the country's commitment to both reducing emissions based on their capability and with support from the international community, and also identifying areas of critical adaptation where they see as priority. So that stays. It's still a document that stays under the principal document of commitment of any country to the world. So that for a country, they pick this up as a declaration and they see how does it match with their own national priority and national circumstances. So a lot of things that come here are things that emerge out of a least common denominator process. You are trying to get every country to come to a common understanding. It does not take away individual countries from picking what is their priority. So a country like Chad, if their priority is livestock, because they're a livestock economy, they will focus a lot on livestock and see how that works for them. A different country will do different things. Congo, basin countries will do different things. They'll probably focus on carbon sinks and so on. So I think it's important for people to understand that that's how it works. It's not that when you have this document, everything else is thrown aside. Okay. So again...
Maybe just another quick one, Philip, that obviously a lot of people would want to understand is the pledges. It stands at 23 billion US dollars, and we've already calculated in Kenyan money, it's about 3.6 trillion shillings. It's a lot of money. And the question is, what happens? How do these pledges really proceed to
Yeah.
benefiting the African continent?
You know, we need to unpack those pledges. I mean, first of all, they're pledges. We know from the history that Pamela talked about is we have a challenge moving from pledges to actual realization. That's number one. Number two, 23 billion US dollars is not a lot of money as you think. So Kenya, if you read Kenya's own nationally determined contribution, between now and 2030, it's costed at about 62 billion. Kenya commits to meet about 8 billion, I think about 8 billion of that from on resources,
Yes.
and about 54 billion from international community. So 24 billion US dollars is not much money. And these pledges are not just for Kenya. This
Yes.
was an African Climate Summit.
Right, yeah.
And so these pledges were for the whole of Africa. So it's actually really not much that you can worth writing home about. Also given the fact that you have to move from pledges to actualization, given the fact that I think in some instances, I haven't looked at it carefully, some countries actually recommitted some pledges that they made before. So it's not new money. So I think maybe just to make people don't feel that, you know, there could be areas where these new pledges can bring in some kind of new resources, but there could also be that many of these pledges would be directed to already committed grants.
All right, I want us to take a break. We have much more to discuss. And when we come back from the break, I'd like us to just take that conversation forward a little bit to help us understand. So once you have that declaration, and forgive my layman sort of illustration, so you have the Nairobi Declaration, and then how do the talks begin to now? So do you now go to the US and say, hey, so you know, the thing we did, you know, in Nairobi last month. So we just want to understand how these things work, because we see, you know, things in the media and declarations. Maybe you can help us just get a backroom understanding of now how we take this document and declaration forward, which doors you knock, how you agree as African countries, like you were saying, Chad says we will take this. Like, is that a conversation that then happens again in a room? You know, we just want to understand how that happens for many of us, because I think this has been a big moment for us to see something happening in our country rather than what happens in Paris and, you know, Copenhagen. Also, there were other voices you know, that were there, and we will be sampling some of those. Lady, gentlemen, thank you for staying with us. This is the Green Edition of Newsgang. We will be right back with much more.